All right, so let's dive into this story. It feels like something right out of a movie, right? A billionaire meeting with the president in the Oval Office, the president shaking up the government, and everybody's whispering about hidden agendas and legend. And this whole thing's like playing out against the backdrop of a snowy Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
This deep dive is about to get interesting. Buckle up.
Yeah, you know what's so fascinating about all this is it's not just some policy changes we're talking about here, right? It's like we're seeing a potential like whole reshaping of how power actually works in the U.S. government. It's not just about what's happening, it's like why it's happening this way.
Okay, so just picture this, right? It's February 11th, 2025. We're in the Oval Office. Snow is coming down outside. And inside, you've got President Trump, right, behind the resolute desk, looking very presidential. But then you've got Elon Musk standing over to his right. And sometimes he's got his son, like, perched up on his shoulders.
I don't know.
It's an image that's pretty hard to shake.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that image itself, like with Musk standing there and Trump sitting, it really kind of captures that unusual power dynamic that's at play here, you know? You've got the president, who we normally think of as having, like, immense power, right, sharing the stage with, well, you know, the world's richest man. Who's wielding, you know, a whole different kind of influence through his wealth and his companies.
Yeah. And right now, Musk is leading a pretty radical shakeup of the entire federal government. He's the head of this brand new department, DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. And his mission is to, as he puts it, purge the federal government, you know, eliminate what he calls waste, streamline operations, you know, really shake things up.
And it's not just theoretical at this point, right? We're actually seeing lawsuits piling up against DOGE. They're challenging DOGE's authority, their actions. Some legal experts are even like saying that we could be heading for a potential constitutional crisis if court rulings get ignored.
Whoa, okay, hold on. A constitutional crisis, that sounds serious. What exactly does that even mean?
Well, I mean, essentially, it means we get into a situation where like the normal functioning of the government as laid out, you know, in the Constitution, breaks down. You know, it just stops working. Like if the executive branch, so in this case, you know, DOGE under Musk's leadership, just starts ignoring court rulings, it can totally undermine the checks and balances that are like the foundation of our democracy. There are, you know, historical precedents for this kind of thing. And it often involves conflicts between different branches of government or challenges to the rule of law in general.
Okay, so Musk is facing some pretty serious legal pushback here. But there's political opposition brewing too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Even some GOP lawmakers are starting to voice their concerns, especially about, you know, the impact of DOGE's deep spending cuts and resulting layoffs, right? They're worried about the economic and political fallout in their own districts as, you know, federal workers start losing their jobs.
Okay, so how's Musk defending all this? I mean, he's going up against legal challenges and pushback from his own party.
Well, his core argument boils down to the claim that there's just massive unchecked waste within the government, right? He points to inefficient programs, outdated practices, and just like layers and layers of bureaucracy that he says are costing taxpayers a fortune, right? He's arguing that DOGE is actually saving democracy, you know, by making the government like leaner and more effective.
So he's basically framing himself as this like warrior against government waste. But this idea isn't exactly new, is it?
You're exactly right. The idea of, you know, quote unquote government waste has been a political talking point for decades, right? What's interesting here is how Musk is tapping into that pre-existing sentiment and sort of weaponizing it. You know what I mean? He's essentially saying, look, we've all been complaining about this for years, and now I'm actually doing something about it.
Yeah. And that message seems to be resonating with a lot of people, at least for now. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's this deep-seated frustration among a lot of voters with what they perceive as just like bureaucratic bloat and inefficiency, you know? They see the government as slow, wasteful, and just, you know, completely out of touch. And Musk, with his image as like a disruptor and an innovator, he really plays into that desire for change. He's basically packaging these, you know, complex governmental issues into a simple, appealing narrative. We're going to cut the fat, streamline things, and just get things done.
It's kind of a modern twist on the classic, like, drain the swamp mentality, right?
Exactly. By portraying federal bureaucrats as, like, the enemy, the embodiment of the swamp, so to speak, it becomes much easier to justify sweeping changes and cuts.
Yeah.
It creates this clear us versus them dynamic.
Right. And initially, you know, Musk and DOGE went after agencies that weren't exactly fan favorites, right? USAID, the foreign aid agency, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which was seen by some as, overreaching. But now they're setting their sights on like bigger targets, which is where things start to get a lot more complicated.
Yeah, exactly. There are, hints out there that agencies like the Department of Education and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, might be next in line for cuts. And this is where the potential for backlash really intensifies, because these agencies directly impact a much larger portion of the population.
Yeah, it seems like cutting funding for education or disaster relief could have some pretty far-reaching consequences, even for people who generally support the idea of smaller government.
Oh, absolutely. Take FEMA, for example, right?
Yeah.
Most people don't really think much about FEMA until a natural disaster hits. Then all of a sudden, it becomes a lifeline for communities in crisis. Cutting funding to FEMA might sound like a way to save money on paper, but it could leave the country incredibly vulnerable when disaster strikes.
Yeah. And we've seen how crucial FEMA is, hurricanes, wildfires, other emergencies. It's not hard to imagine how those cuts could actually translate into real-world suffering, if response times are slower, if resources are limited.
Exactly. And this is where the political calculus gets really tricky for both Trump and Musk. They're appealing to this desire for efficiency and cost-cutting, right? But they also have to weigh the potential risks and consequences of those cuts. Like, what if a major disaster hits and FEMA isn't prepared? The political fallout could be enormous.
Yeah. So they're walking a pretty tightrope here, right? Pushing for this radical change.
Yeah.
But they're also playing with fire.
And it's not just FEMA. There's a lot of concern about potential cuts to the National Institutes of Health, too. The NIH, this is the agency, that's responsible for funding a huge amount of medical research in the U.S. And some experts are warning that, cuts could have just a devastating impact on scientific progress.
Yeah, I can see why people would be worried about that. I mean, the NIH funds research on, everything from cancer to Alzheimer's to, infectious diseases. Cutting funding could really slow down the development of new treatments and cures.
Exactly. And it's not just about the direct impact on research either, right?
Yeah.
The NIH provides grants to universities and research institutions all across the country. These grants support, jobs, training programs, cutting-edge facilities. So cuts to the NIH could have this, ripple effect throughout the scientific community and the economy as a whole.
It seems like Musk is betting that the appeal of smaller government and lower taxes will outweigh those concerns, at least in the short term.
Yeah, that seems to be the strategy. He's tapping into this long-standing debate about the role and size of government. You have people who believe that, the government should be as small as possible, focusing primarily on things like national defense and protecting individual liberties, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who argue for a more active role for the government in, regulating the economy, providing social safety nets, and promoting the general welfare.
Right. Sounds like Musk is trying to appeal to both sides of that debate, at least to some extent.
You could say that. On one hand, he's appealing to the libertarian small government crowd with his talk of slashing bureaucracy and reducing the government's footprint, right? But on the other hand, he's also framing his efforts as a way to make the government more efficient and effective in serving the people, which resonates with those who believe in a more active government, but want it to work better.
Right. So he's kind of casting a wide net here, trying to bring together people who might not normally agree on the role of government. But is this approach actually viable? Can you really shrink the government that drastically without causing some, unintended consequences?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on how those reforms are implemented, what gets cut, and what priorities are set. You can't just, slash budgets indiscriminately without considering the potential consequences.
Right. It's easy to get behind the idea of eliminating waste and inefficiency in the abstract, right? But when you start talking about cutting specific programs, things get a lot more complicated.
Oh, absolutely. You have to remember that, every government program, every budget line item represents real people, real services, real impacts. Take, for example, funding for food safety inspections, right? It might seem like an easy target for cuts, but if those inspections are reduced, it could lead to outbreaks of foodborne illnesses, which can have devastating health and economic consequences.
Right, yeah. It's a reminder that not all government spending is created equal. Some programs might seem unnecessary or wasteful on the surface, but they could be playing a really vital role behind the scenes.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that the government isn't just some faceless bureaucracy, right? It's made up of people, teachers, scientists, park rangers, social workers, firefighters. The list goes on and on. These are people who are dedicated to public service, who work hard to make our country a better place. And when you start talking about like drastic cuts to the government, you're talking about impacting the lives of those people and the people they serve.
Right, yeah. It's easy to get caught up in the political drama of it all, the clash of personalities, the power struggles. But we have to remember that there are human stories behind all of this. Real people whose lives are affected by the decisions being made in Washington.
And that brings up another crucial point, the issue of conflicts of interest. Elon Musk's companies, like SpaceX and Tesla, they have billions of dollars in government contracts. So now he's in a position where he's overseeing agencies that could potentially benefit his own businesses.
That raises some serious red flags, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, how can we be sure that he's making decisions in the best interest of the country when he has such a vested interest in the outcome?
Yeah, it's a valid concern. And it gets to the heart of the debate about transparency and accountability. Musk argues that, since his company's contracts are public, there's no issue. He's essentially saying everything's out in the open, so there's no need to worry.
But that feels a little too simplistic, doesn't it? Just because something is technically public doesn't mean it's easily accessible or understandable to the average person.
You're exactly right. And even if all the information is out there, it's still a matter of perception. The optics of having someone with such a significant financial stake in government contracts, leading the charge to reform the government, are bound to raise eyebrows. It creates a perception, fair or not, that decisions could be influenced by personal gain rather than the public good.
Right. And this isn't just about the appearance of impropriety, is it? There's a real possibility that Musk's decisions, even if they're well-intentioned, could inadvertently benefit his own companies.
Absolutely. Even if he's trying to be impartial, it's difficult to completely separate your personal interests from your public duties. When they're so intertwined, there's always a risk of, unconscious bias, of making decisions that, while they might seem logical on the surface, could ultimately benefit your own bottom line.
So we have this unprecedented situation where the world's richest man is now in charge of streamlining the government. And while he claims to be doing it for the good of the country, there are some serious questions about potential conflicts of interest. And whether he can truly be impartial.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case study. In the complexities of power, wealth, and influence in a democracy. And it raises some fundamental questions about how we define public service. In an era where the lines between government and private enterprise are becoming increasingly blurred.
Yeah, it feels like we're in uncharted territory here. And it's hard to predict what the long-term consequences of this, experiment will be.
One thing's for sure, this is a story that's going to continue to unfold in the months and years to come, and it's one that we'll be watching closely.
So we've got this, billionaire shaking up the government, these potential conflicts of interest, and just a whole lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
But zooming out a little bit here, what does this all mean for democracy itself?
Yeah, that's the question that keeps me up at night, to be honest. What we're witnessing here, it really challenges some fundamental assumptions about how power works in a democracy,
Right.
Traditionally, we think of power as flowing from the people to their elected representatives. We vote for our leaders, and they're supposed to represent our interests.
Right, yeah. It's like the basic idea of representative democracy. The people have the power, and they delegate it to their elected officials.
Right, but what we're seeing now with Musk and DOGE is a different kind of power dynamic. It's not just about elected officials making decisions anymore. It's about a billionaire with immense wealth and influence, shaping the government from within.
Yeah. And it's not just his wealth either, right? It's also his control over these massive platforms like, the X network. He can just completely bypass traditional media and directly communicate with millions of people, shaping public opinion, driving the narrative.
Exactly. He has, both economic power through his wealth and media power through his platform. That's a pretty potent combination. And it allows him to exert influence in ways that we haven't really seen before.
Yeah. Some critics are even calling this a techno-plutocracy, the system where the wealthy elite, empowered by technology, basically hold the reins of power. Do you think that term is accurate?
I mean, it's a provocative term for sure, but it does capture some of the anxieties surrounding this whole situation. The concern is that unelected individuals with vast wealth and media influence could potentially undermine democratic accountability. Like, if they can essentially dictate government policy, then what happens to the voice of the people?
Right. It raises questions about whether our current systems of governance are even equipped to handle this new reality where power is concentrated in the hands of, a few tech billionaires.
Right. Our institutions were designed for a different era, and they may not be adequately prepared to deal with this kind of concentrated power. We need to think critically about how to ensure that our democratic processes remain robust and resilient in the face of these new challenges.
Yeah. Another thing that worries me is this apparent disregard for expertise that we're seeing. It's like experience and knowledge don't even matter anymore. It's all about who can disrupt the system the fastest.
Yeah, you hit on a crucial point there. There's this growing anti-intellectualism, the suspicion of anyone with deep knowledge or experience in government. It's as if expertise itself is seen as a liability, like it's somehow incompatible with innovation or progress.
Right. But governing is incredibly complex. It requires a deep understanding of policy, institutions, and how different parts of the government interact with each other. You can't just parachute someone in from the tech world, no matter how brilliant they are, and expect them to just magically solve all the problems.
Exactly. Governing requires a different skill set, a different way of thinking. It's about understanding the nuances of policy, navigating the complexities of bureaucracy, and building consensus among diverse stakeholders.
And, when you push out these experienced civil servants, you're losing a wealth of institutional knowledge. These are people who have dedicated their careers to public service, who understand the intricacies of government, and who have a deep commitment to the common good.
Yeah, their expertise is invaluable. And when you dismiss or disregard that expertise, you're essentially governing by gut feeling rather than informed decision-making. And that's a recipe for disaster.
So we've got this potential shift in the balance of power, this disregard for expertise. And it seems like a growing erosion of trust in government.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. When people see these drastic changes happening, when they see decisions being made without transparency or accountability, it breeds cynicism and distrust. And that cynicism can be really corrosive. It can make people less likely to engage in the democratic process, less likely to believe that their voices even matter.
Right. It creates a sense of apathy and disengagement, which is incredibly dangerous for a healthy democracy.
Exactly. A thriving democracy requires active participation from its citizens. It requires people to believe that the system can work, that their voices can actually make a difference.
So where do we go from here? What's the path forward in light of all these challenges?
Well, I think the first step is to just acknowledge the seriousness of these issues. We can't just shrug our shoulders and say, well, that's just how things are now. We need to have an open and honest conversation about the role of wealth and technology in our democracy. We need to think critically about how to ensure that power remains accountable, that expertise is valued, and that trust in government is restored.
Yeah, it feels like we're at a crossroads here. We can either continue down this path of, concentrated power and techno-plutocracy, or we can reaffirm our commitment to democratic values, to the principles of accountability, transparency, and participation.
And it's up to all of us to decide which path we want to take. It's going to require active citizenship, informed debate, and a willingness to hold those in power accountable, whether they're elected officials or billionaires with outsized influence.
Right. It's a call to action for all of us. We can't just sit back and watch as our democracy is reshaped. We need to engage, to participate, to make our voices heard.
And we need to demand more from our leaders. We need to demand transparency, accountability, and a genuine commitment to the common good.
Well said. It's been an eye-opening deep dive, and I hope our listeners are walking away with a deeper understanding of the complexities and challenges facing our democracy.
And as always, we encourage everyone to continue exploring these issues, to engage in thoughtful discussions, and to be active participants in shaping the future they want to see.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.